I want to start by saying that in the analysis of earlier fieldwork data, Mauss was a major source of inspiration, particularly the essays on sacrifice and the gift. But in my present work on industrial labour, I find him quite unhelpful, and I'm going to try and explain why. The specific context of this work is the steel town in central India of Bhilai, which was built some 50 years back on a greenfield site with the fraternal aid of the Soviet Union, and is now one of the largest steel plants in Asia. And it was at that time a self-consciously nation-building project, and that it was a kind of icon for Nehru's dream of a modern, secular, socialist India. So, on some kind of purchase on this brave new world of Indian socialism, where in Mauss am I to look? Well, I'm not a proper paid-up Mauss scholar, so I may have got it wrong and been looking in the wrong place. But where I have looked, particularly, is at his sociological assessment of Bolshevism, which asks whether it can be regarded as a species of socialism, and raises the question of what that is and how it might be achieved. In Britain, it's not a well-known work, but it ought to be, if only because it was written at more or less exactly the same time as The Gift, and to my mind there are real similarities and continuities between that essay and the concluding chapter of The Gift. And I'm going to refer to both of them. And I'm going to say that both seem to me to be frustrating and implausible. And for the reason, and for the same reason, which is basically that in my contemporary fieldwork experience, social class, even more than caste, ethnicity, or a religious community, is the major determinant of life chances and the most salient social identity. And what's absent from Mauss, I find, is any sense of conflicting class interests and the way in which these might bear on the socialist project. And it seems to me symptomatic that the index to Fournier's comprehensive biography doesn't even have an entry for class. Is Bolshevism socialism? Yes, says Mauss, but it's a failed experiment. And what it teaches us mainly are the mistakes to avoid. And Mauss is light on any concrete suggestions of how we might arrive at it. In the economic field, the attempt to abolish money was disastrous. The attempt to establish communism of consumption was, he says, absurd, and even more absurd was the attempt to abolish the market, for, he says, a society without markets is inconceivable. Industrial and commercial freedom is essential, and the authoritarian direction of industry, the command economy, is, he says, opposed to the exchangeist nature of modern man. And just in passing, I note that Nehruvian socialism never tried to abolish the market, though it certainly did try to take control of the commanding heights of the economy, to assume what he called authoritarian direction over industries like coal and steel. Another important reason for the Bolshevik failure was Lenin and Trotsky's unwillingness to conceive of the revolution as a national one, and it never became the work of the nation. The Tsarist regime was chronically enfeebled, and when it almost spontaneously collapsed, the Bolsheviks assumed the powers of the Tsar and ruled through much the same methods. The takeover was the work, he says, of a jacquerie of peasants and soldiers, and their tyranny was in the end no better than that of the aristocrats, officers, and the bourgeois. To be durable, he argues, socialism must be the work of the general will of the citizens. The takeover, he says, must be organized and conscious, and it must be organized by a very large number of the enlightened citizenry. Again, just in parenthesis, I note that there are obviously huge differences. Something similar might be said of Nehruvian socialism. It was the gift of an enlightened elite. It was a passive revolution in Gramsci's sense, and it was never a genuinely national project that took root in the population at large. But my main point here concerns the way in which this general will of the citizens is supposed to come about. Mauss doesn't tell us. Nor, in sociological terms, does he identify the enlightened citizenry who are going to manage the transfer of power. And an even bigger gap, we get no sense that there might be an unenlightened citizenry with machine guns who have more concern for their own interests than those of the national will. Now in that, the assessment of Bolshevism recalls several rather gnomic passages in the final chapter of The Gift. Take this. I quote, "We are returning, as indeed we must do, to the old theme of noble expenditure. It is essential that, as in Anglo-Saxon countries, and so many contemporary societies, savage and civilized, that the rich should come once more, freely or by obligation, to consider themselves as the treasurers of their fellow citizens." Are returning? What's the evidence of that? And why didn't somebody tell Sir Fred Goodwin, who, for the French audience, is a famous rip-off banker who refused to repay a whole lot of money? So, where's the evidence that we're returning to this world of noble expenditure? When Mauss says that it's essential that the bankers become treasurers for the common weal, well, we might agree, but it seems that Sir Fred Goodwin does not. He just thumbs his noses at us. So there's something that seems to be preventing the essential from becoming the real. Or again, take Mauss's parable of King Arthur's Round Table. King Arthur had an astute carpenter, and the astute carpenter allowed him to ensure, I quote, that his knights would never come to blows, so that wherever Arthur took his table, contented and invisible remained his noble company, and this today is the way of nations that are strong, rich, good, and happy. That's not sociology, it's a fairy tale. Wouldn't most of us think that it's the sociologist's task to explain why it was that the knights agreed to sit round the table? Perhaps because the king would hit them over the head, or the peasants would stop paying taxes. But Mauss doesn't ask that question. Why not? Well, one obvious answer might be that in that last chapter he was more interested in making normative statements about how things ought to be than sociological statements about how they are. After all, he does refer to some of his conclusions as moral and ethical. But even so, it hardly seems adequate to tell us how our world should be ordered without offering some reason to suppose that it could be ordered in that way.